I never imagined that at 75, after nearly half a century of serving the Pennsylvania court system, I would end up standing in the doorway of my own son's house, feeling like an uninvited guest. The winter wind cut through my coat that morning, sharp enough to make my recovering legs tremble, but not nearly as sharp as the words I was about to hear. My son, Michael, opened the door with a tired half-smile, the kind that looked more like an obligation than love. "Mom, you made it," he said as if he hadn't insisted I move in after my stroke. "Come." The warmth of the living room hit my face immediately, but even with the heater humming and the smell of cinnamon candles in the air, something felt wrong. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, sat at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone, not even glancing up to greet me. I placed my small travel bag on the floor and looked around. The walls were decorated with smiling family photos, birthday parties, vacations, graduations, but I wasn't in a single one. I tried to push away the thought. Michael cleared his throat. "So mommed about your room." I smiled. For years, he'd promised I'd always have a place with him. "I hope it's not too much trouble," I whispered. Rachel finally looked up. Her expression was flat, annoyed even. "It's not trouble," she said. "We just need space. You know how small this house is." I nodded gently. "Of course." Michael's voice shifted, too casual. "We set up the garage for you." I froze. "The garage?" I repeated softly, unsure if I misheard. "It's temporary," he said quickly. "Just until we figure out where you fit best." Where I fit? The words stung like ice water down my spine. Rachel stood and pushed her chair in with a sharp scrape. "Mom," she said, emphasizing the word as if it tasted bitter. "You'll be fine there. It's quiet. Private. No stairs. Besides, we need our rooms for work and for Maddie." Private. Not safe. Not warm. Not loving. Just private. Michael placed a hand on my shoulder. "Barely a touch. I slept there for 2 nights, he said, trying to sound reassuring. It wasn't bad. But something in his eyes avoided mine. I wanted to ask why a woman who raised him alone, who worked double shifts, who lived through a stroke, why she was now being placed in a garage. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "If that's what works for you," I whispered. Rachel smirked at Michael as if she'd won something, and my heart cracked a little. Moments later, I followed Michael through the hallway, past warm rooms with soft lights and fluffy blankets, past the kitchen that smelled of fresh coffee, past the living room where the heater glowed a comforting amber, and then into the cold. The garage door groaned as he lifted it. A bitter gust rushed in. Inside were dusty boxes, old sports equipment, a stack of forgotten holiday decorations, and in the corner, a thin folding cot with a blanket that looked older than I was. "We'll get you a heater tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow?" I nodded again, fighting the tremor in my hands. The cold wasn't the only thing making them shake. When Michael left, the door shut behind him much too quickly, and much too eagerly. The silence in the garage was heavy, cold in a way that crept into bones and memories. I sat on the cot, taking in the shadows around me, shadows that looked like they belonged to abandoned things. I was one of them now. That first night I didn't sleep. My breath hovered white in the dim air. Every crack in the wall whispered a memory from my old life. The courtroom halls, the tidy files, the gavel's echo. The respect I once commanded. How did a woman who organized justice for 47 years end up forgotten in a garage? Around midnight, I heard their voices through the thin wall. Rachel's harsh whisper cut the darkness like a blade. "She'll get used to it. The garage is the only place she won't suffocate us." Michael grumbled something, but Rachel continued. "If she can survive the winter, maybe we'll consider moving her inside later." Every word struck like a blow. Survive the winter? I pressed a trembling hand over my mouth, so they wouldn't hear the small sob that escaped. I wasn't their guest. I wasn't their family. I was an inconvenience. A problem to be stored away. A burden. I curled up on the cot, pulling the thin blanket over myself, praying for morning, for light, for warmth, for something that felt like dignity. As sleep finally pulled at my bones, one last thought echoed in my mind. This was not a home. And this was not love. That night, after forcing myself through the cold that seeped into my bones like a slow, merciless frost, I woke up to the faint sound of footsteps and muffled voices coming from inside the house. Voices that carried irritation instead of concern, frustration instead of warmth. And though I didn't want to listen, the thin walls of the garage left me no choice. Rachel was complaining again, her tone sharp and impatient, saying she didn't sign up for this kind of responsibility, that having me here was already ruining their routine, their privacy, their comfort, as if my very existence threatened the stability of their marriage. Michael's responses were softer, more hesitant, but instead of defending me, instead of reminding her that I was his mother, the woman who raised him alone, the woman who worked nights and holidays so he could go to college, he simply agreed in weary sighs, the sound of a man who chose peace with his wife over loyalty to the woman who gave him life. I stared at the dim ceiling of the garage, allowing the cold to settle deeper into my frail body, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. And I wondered how love could shrink so quietly, how respect could fade without making a sound. By morning, my joints ached so badly that it took me minutes just to sit up. And for a moment, I contemplated staying on the cot forever, hidden under the thin blanket where no one could see how broken I felt. But years of discipline, of duty, of waking at dawn for court hearings and schedules, pushed me to my feet. I stepped outside into the crisp winter air, each breath stinging my throat, and made my way toward the house. The kitchen was warm, almost painfully warm after the bitter cold of the garage, and I stood there silently, taking in the sight of Rachel and Maddie laughing over pancakes, while Michael scrolled through his phone. For a fleeting second, I wished I could step back into my old life, the life where I mattered, where people looked up when I walked into a room, where my presence meant something. Rachel finally noticed me and frowned, her expression tightening as if my appearance disrupted her perfect little morning. "Mom, you scared us," she said, though nothing in her voice suggested concern. "You should knock before coming in." I opened my mouth, ready to apologize out of habit, but the apology got trapped in my throat. Why was I apologizing for stepping into a home I was told was mine? Michael glanced up briefly, giving me a half-smile that vanished almost instantly. Then he simply said, "Morning, Mom. There's oatmeal if you want." Oatmeal. The same bowl I ate in the hospital when I couldn't swallow properly after my stroke. I nodded gently and made my way to the counter, ignoring the ache in my legs, the stiffness in my hands, the cold still lingering beneath my skin, and the heavy realization pressing on my chest that in this house, I was living beside them, not with them. When I sat down with my small bowl, Maddie looked at me curiously, her innocent eyes filled with the kind of honesty only children possess. "Grandma, why do you sleep in the garage?" she asked. Rachel dropped her fork immediately, her jaw tightening, while Michael shot me an uncomfortable glance. Before I could answer, Rachel forced a laugh and said, "Sweetheart, Grandma likes her space." Her space. A cold, dusty garage with a folding cot and no heater. Maddie frowned. But garages are for cars, not people. And in that small sentence, spoken without malice, without agenda, the truth echoed louder than any argument ever could. No one replied. Silence took over the room like fog settling over a forgotten field. After breakfast, Rachel hurried off to work, and Michael left shortly after, leaving me alone with the ticking clock and the growing heaviness in my chest. I washed the dishes quietly, remembering how I once cooked entire holiday dinners alone, how I once filled a home with warmth and laughter, how I once belonged somewhere. Hours later, I stepped back into the garage, and the chill wrapped around me once more, almost greeting me like an old, cruel friend. I sat on the cot, clutching my hands together, trying to stop the trembling, whether from the cold or from something deeper, I no longer knew. I tried to remind myself that I was lucky to have a place to stay, lucky to have survived the stroke, lucky to have a son at all. But a question kept surfacing no matter how hard I pushed it away. If staying alive meant living like this, was it truly living? The third day in Michael's house brought with it a strange kind of heaviness, the sort that settles in your chest so quietly you almost mistake it for part of your own breathing. And as I sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the garage, listening to the faint sounds of life happening inside the house, clattering dishes, muffled laughter, the rhythmic footsteps of a family moving around me but never toward me, I realized how painfully easy it was to disappear in a place where everyone was too busy to notice your presence. The heater still hadn't arrived, though Michael had promised it 2 days in a row, and I tried not to hold that broken promise against him, reminding myself again and again that he had a family, responsibilities, a life that didn't revolve around me. But as my fingers numbed and my breath fogged the air in front of me, even the gentlest excuses felt hollow. Around noon, Michael finally opened the garage door with a sigh that wasn't meant to be heard but echoed loudly in the cold space. "Mom, I need your help," he said, but his tone lacked warmth. It felt more like a command than a request. I followed him to the kitchen where Maddie sat doing homework, and Rachel stood leaning against the counter, looking impatient as though my mere presence delayed her day. "We're hosting friends tonight," Rachel began, crossing her arms. "So we need the living room to look good. Can you handle that?" The word stunned me. Not the task, but the way she said, "Can you handle that?" As if I were a fragile inconvenience instead of a grown woman who once managed entire legal departments. I nodded without protest and quietly gathered the scattered toys, folded the blankets, cleaned the surfaces, and arranged the cushions neatly, trying to ignore Rachel's watchful eyes following every move I made. She didn't say thank you. Instead, she inspected my work like a supervisor reviewing the effort of someone she never fully trusted. Hours passed, and I stayed mostly invisible, moving silently from task to task until my legs began to ache and my back tightened with an old pain I thought the doctors had cured. When evening arrived and their guests filled the house with laughter and voices, Rachel approached me and whispered sharply, "Maybe stay in the garage tonight. Just to give us space." And she smiled, polite on the surface but cold underneath, a smile that told me it wasn't a suggestion but an instruction. I stepped outside quietly, closing the door behind me, listening to the muffled sound of happiness happening without me. A celebration I had prepared but wasn't welcome in. In the garage, the cold felt deeper, harsher, as though the temperature itself understood that I had been pushed away. I sat on the cot, wrapping my thin blanket tighter, and wondered if this was what aging truly looked like. Not illness, not weakness, but slowly fading into the background of your own family's life. As night deepened, I heard the faint echoes of Rachel's laughter, bright and full, and Michael's voice blending with the chatter inside, and I realized painfully that not one of those guests even knew I existed under the same roof. It was as if I were a ghost, close enough to hear life happening, but destined never to be part of it. I tried to distract myself by looking at old photos on my phone. Pictures from decades ago, snapshots of a younger me holding a baby Michael with tired eyes but a proud smile. But the longer I stared at those images, the harder it became to recognize the woman I once was. I touched the screen gently, as if tracing the outline of a past that felt distant, unreachable. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me down, and I lay back, my body sinking into the cold cot, staring at the dark ceiling that seemed to lower itself inch by inch, pressing against my chest. I closed my eyes, and a single thought drifted through the emptiness of the garage like a quiet whisper. When did I stop being someone worth coming home to? The next morning began with a cold so sharp it felt like needles pricking through my thin sweater. And for a long moment I lay completely still on the narrow cot, trying to gather the strength to push myself upright, feeling every bit of my 75 years settle heavy into my bones. And as I finally rose to my feet, each movement stiff and slow, I couldn't ignore how the garage seemed to grow colder with each passing day, as if it knew I didn't belong there, as if it resented my presence, just as much as Rachel did. When I finally stepped into the house, the warmth inside felt almost foreign, too soft, too comfortable, like a luxury I no longer had permission to enjoy. And I paused near the kitchen doorway, watching Rachel move around the counter with her usual clipped efficiency, while Michael sat rubbing sleep from his eyes. The moment Rachel noticed me, her smile tightened and she casually said, "Mom, I hope you slept well." The kind of empty politeness people use when they'd rather not speak at all. I forced a nod, though we both knew I hadn't slept more than 2 hours. As I poured myself a small cup of coffee, grateful for even the smallest warmth, I overheard Rachel sigh loudly and whisper to Michael, "We really can't keep doing this, Mike. She's slowing everything down. This house isn't built to take care of an elderly person." The words cut deeper than she expected, and before Michael could answer, Maddie ran into the room, cheerful and bright, clutching a drawing in her small hands. She came straight to me and held it up proudly, a picture of a house with 4 figures drawn outside, including a tiny version of me standing beside her. My throat tightened, and I bent down to kiss her forehead, but Rachel quickly stepped forward and pulled Maddie away, muttering, "Give Grandma some space, sweetheart." Space. The same word they kept using like a gentle excuse, when in truth it was nothing more than a barrier pushing me farther and farther away. Later that afternoon, as Rachel left for errands and Michael disappeared into his office, I attempted to help around the house again, dusting shelves, folding laundry, wiping down surfaces. Small tasks that once made me feel useful, needed, important. But every time Rachel returned, she acted as though my efforts were inconveniences rather than help. At one point she snapped, "Mom, please don't reorganize things. I have a system." It was a small sentence, but it carried the weight of 100 unspoken complaints, and I felt myself shrink just a little more. When evening arrived, I found myself once again instructed to eat early, just so things don't get crowded in the kitchen. And after washing my single plate, I retreated to the garage before anyone even needed to hint at it. The moment I stepped inside, the familiar chill wrapped around me like a cruel embrace, and I sank slowly onto the cot, staring at the concrete floor as tears silently filled my eyes. I had spent my life building stability for others, my son, my colleagues, the community I served. But now that my own stability had begun to crumble, it felt as though the world was quietly stepping aside, letting me fall. I tried remembering the woman I once was, strong, opinionated, respected, the woman who held families together through trials and hearings, who fought for justice with everything she had. Yet the version of me sitting alone in that freezing garage felt like a stranger, small, invisible, forgotten. As the night deepened and the cold seeped into my bones, a frightening thought whispered inside me. Maybe I wasn't being mistreated. Maybe I was just no longer worth the trouble. That thought lingered long after my eyes finally closed, settling heavily into my chest, shaping itself into a truth I was terrified to acknowledge. Because if your own family begins to see you as a burden, what part of yourself is left to hold on to? Days passed in a slow, colorless blur, each one blending into the next like pages of a book that no one cared to read. And although I tried to stay out of the way, to exist quietly, to make myself small enough not to disturb anyone, the tension in the house grew thicker with every passing hour. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Pennsylvania rooftops and the sky turned a somber shade of blue, Michael came into the garage with a look on his face that made my stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. He sat on a small stool beside the cot, avoiding my eyes at first, tracing the lines on the concrete floor with the tip of his shoe like a guilty child preparing to confess something shameful. "Mom," he finally said, his voice tense and uncomfortable. "Rachel thinks, we think, maybe it's time to look into other arrangements." My heart stumbled. Other arrangements? I didn't want to ask, but the words came out anyway, barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard. "There's an assisted living place near downtown. It's clean. It's safe. And it might be better for you. Better for me." The phrase tasted like ash. Rachel's voice suddenly echoed from the doorway, sharp and unapologetic. "We can't keep doing this. It's too much. The house feels crowded. You need proper care, more than we can provide." Proper care? I stared at them, my son and his wife, 2 people I had supported for decades, 2 people I loved with a depth they clearly could no longer understand. My throat tightened painfully. "I don't want to go anywhere," I said softly. This is my family. Rachel let out a frustrated breath as if I were being unreasonable. We're not saying forever. Just until things settle. Settle? Nothing was unsettled except their patience for me. Before I could respond, Maddie came running in, holding a small blanket in her hands, the one I had knitted for her when she was born. Her innocent eyes flicked between us, sensing the heaviness in the air. "Daddy, why are you making Grandma sad?" she asked, her tiny voice cracking the silence like a fragile piece of glass. Michael froze. Rachel stiffened. And for a moment, guilt flickered across my son's face like a dying flame. Maddie climbed onto my lap, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders as if she could protect me from the truth unfolding around us. I held her gently, breathing in the soft scent of her hair, wishing that love could be enough to keep me here. Rachel cleared her throat and motioned for Maddie to come to her. And when the little girl reluctantly obeyed, the coldness returned instantly, like a door slamming shut. "We'll talk later," Rachel said flatly, pulling Maddie away. Michael stood up, rubbing his forehead, his voice weary. "Please try to understand, Mom. We're just trying to do what's best." Best for who? I wanted to scream the question, to shake him and ask where the son I raised had gone. But instead, I nodded numbly, feeling myself detach from the moment like a balloon slowly drifting away from the hand that once held it tightly. After they left, I sat alone in the dim garage, listening to the distant hum of cars on the street, the faint clatter of dishes inside the house, and the sound of my own breathing, shallow, uneven, fragile. I looked around at the boxes stacked in the corners, the cobwebs glistening faintly in the low light, the cold creeping back under my skin. And I wondered how a life so full of purpose could end in a place meant for storage. I closed my eyes, letting the ache wash over me in slow, heavy waves, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something break inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but softly, like a quiet surrender. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong here. Maybe this house wasn't mine anymore. Maybe my presence had become a burden too heavy for them to carry. But as the thought settled like dust on the concrete floor, another question rose painfully in its place. If I wasn't welcome in the home I helped build, then where in the world was I supposed to go? The next morning felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the previous night's conversation had seeped into the cold concrete floor of the garage and risen with the dawn, pressing down on my chest with a quiet but relentless force. I woke before the sun, my joints stiff and aching, my breath visible in the icy air. And for a long moment I sat still, staring at the door that separated me from the warmth of the house I no longer felt welcome in. I kept thinking about Michael's words, other arrangements, and the way Rachel's eyes had hardened the instant I resisted, as though my desire to stay with my own family was somehow an inconvenience too large for her tidy world. When I finally gathered the strength to stand and push the garage door open, the cold morning air wrapped around me like a bitter reminder of all the warmth I had lost. Inside the house, I found Rachel packing Maddie's lunch while humming under her breath, her movements swift, precise, and devoid of the slightest acknowledgement of the conversation we had the night before. When she glanced at me, her expression didn't soften. It hardened, almost as if she was bracing herself for another argument she had already decided she wouldn't entertain. "Good morning," I whispered, though my voice barely carried. She didn't reply. Instead, she called for Michael, her tone urgent and clipped. He emerged from the hallway rubbing his eyes, clearly exhausted, not from work or stress, but from the weight of trying to stretch loyalty between his wife and his mother. "Mom," he said, avoiding my gaze. "We should go see the place today. The assisted living home." His voice trembled ever so slightly, but he steadied himself quickly, as if he had already rehearsed the lines in his head. I felt my heart tighten in my chest, not with anger, but with a sorrow so deep it almost numbed me. "Today?" I asked, the word barely leaving my throat. Rachel stepped in before he could answer. "It's better to do it sooner. Waiting will only make things harder." Harder for who? For them? Or for me? I wanted to ask, but I swallowed the words because I knew the answer wouldn't change anything. Maddie ran into the kitchen at that moment, her drawing from earlier still clutched in her hand. "Grandma, can you help me with my hair?" she asked, her innocence cutting through the tension like a small, fragile light. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if Rachel would object, but when she didn't, I knelt down and gently brushed Maddie's soft curls with my trembling hands. She looked at me as though nothing in the world was wrong, as though I was still her safe place, her comfort, her constant. "Are you staying with us forever?" she asked brightly. The question hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked into her wide-open eyes that didn't yet understand the world's cruel ways. And before I could answer, Rachel stepped forward quickly. "Maddie, Grandma might be moving somewhere special soon," she said, injecting forced cheer into the words. "A place where people her age can rest." Rest. As if I were furniture being moved to storage. Maddie frowned. "Why? Doesn't she want to stay with us?" Rachel didn't reply. Michael looked away, and I felt something inside me fracture quietly. After they left for the day, the house fell silent, a different silence from usual, a silence heavy with finality, with the sense that something irreversible had begun its slow descent. I stood alone in the living room, taking in the warm walls, the soft cushions, the photos that didn't include me, and I wondered how a place could look so much like a home and feel nothing like it. I walked back to the garage slowly, each step echoing with memories I wished I could forget. Memories of raising Michael alone, of working double shifts to afford his school supplies, of comforting him after nightmares, of choosing every sacrifice without hesitation. And yet here I was, standing in a cold, dim space allotted to me like an afterthought, being told I would be better off somewhere else. As I sat on the edge of the cot, staring at the thin blanket that offered little warmth, a truth I had been avoiding rose quietly in my mind, steady and painful. Love doesn't always disappear with a storm. It sometimes fades slowly, quietly, with every small decision that places convenience above care. And when I closed my eyes, letting the cold wrap around me once more, I realized with a hollow ache that I wasn't afraid of the assisted living home at all. What terrified me was the possibility that my son had already let me go long before he said the words out loud. The day Michael finally drove me to the assisted living facility felt unreal, as if I were floating helplessly through someone else's life, watching it unfold from a distance, unable to change its course. The morning air was dull and heavy, and as I slowly lifted myself from the cot, every part of my body felt weighed down, not by age, but by the quiet disappointment settling deep in my chest. Michael appeared in the doorway, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes darting away from mine every time I tried to meet them. "Mom, we should go early," he murmured, his voice hollow, as if he were reciting a line rather than speaking from his heart. I steadied myself, gripping the edge of the chair beside me, my legs trembling from more than just weakness. The garage felt colder that morning, colder than it had ever been, though I wasn't sure if it was the temperature or the ache inside me. Before stepping out, I glanced around the space that had been my room. The boxes, the cobwebs, the thin blanket folded neatly at the foot of the cot, and a strange realization washed over me. I had been living among things that no longer mattered to anyone. Forgotten objects, and a forgotten woman. Michael hovered behind me as I walked toward the car, but he didn't offer his arm. He didn't ask if I needed help. And for the first time, I didn't reach out. I moved slowly, carefully, with the dignity of someone who refused to let sorrow turn her into a burden. As we drove through Pennsylvania's quiet suburbs, the world outside the window blurred into soft shapes and muted colors. Children walking to school with their backpacks bouncing, neighbors waving to each other over fences, a dog tugging excitedly at its leash. All simple scenes of ordinary life, scenes that once filled me with warmth but now reminded me of everything slipping away. The facility wasn't far, but every mile felt like another piece of my heart being packed away, stored somewhere unreachable. When we pulled up in front of the building, a tall structure with brick walls, wide windows, and a cheerful sign decorated with plastic flowers, I forced myself to breathe. Michael cleared his throat. "They take good care of people here," he said quietly, his voice thin. "You won't be alone." But the words didn't comfort me. They hovered in the air like a lie neither of us had the courage to admit. Inside, a receptionist with bright lipstick and an overly cheerful smile approached us. "Welcome," she said, her voice too loud, too polished. "You must be our new resident." Resident. The word struck me like a cold blade. Not mother. Not guest. Resident. Someone placed somewhere. Someone allotted a room. Someone repositioned because her presence no longer fit into the tidy corners of someone else's life. As she led us down the hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, I glanced at Michael walking beside me. Hands still in pockets, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the ground. I wanted him to look at me. I wanted him to see the fear in my eyes, the heartbreak weighing on my steps, the silent plea for him to say, "Mom, let's go home." But he didn't. Instead, he simply nodded mechanically at everything the receptionist said, as though this were a business transaction, and I were just another responsibility to be checked off his list. When we reached the small room they had prepared for me, a neatly made bed, a dresser, a small lamp with a floral shade, I felt a hollow ache bloom in my chest. It wasn't awful. It wasn't dirty or unsafe. But it wasn't mine. It wasn't home. Michael finally spoke, his voice cracking slightly as he said, "You'll be okay here, Mom." And I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something painful. He believed it. Or maybe he needed to believe it. Because believing the truth would have shattered him. I forced a small smile, the kind a mother gives even when her heart is breaking, and whispered, "I know." Silence settled between us, thick and suffocating, until he finally stepped forward and hugged me. But it was a short, hesitant embrace, polite, restrained, full of guilt rather than love. When he pulled away, he whispered, "I'll visit soon." Soon. A word that stretched endlessly into uncertainty. I nodded again. I always nodded. And then, as he walked toward the door, I watched my son's silhouette fade down the hallway, the distance between us growing with every step he took. When the door finally closed and the quiet hum of the facility swallowed the last echo of his footsteps, the truth hit me with a force so powerful it stole my breath for a moment. I wasn't returning home. I had been left somewhere safe, somewhere clean, somewhere practical, but not somewhere loved. And as I sat on the edge of the neatly made bed, hands trembling in my lap, a tear slid down my cheek, not because I had been abandoned, but because I finally understood the most painful reality of all. Sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for grow in directions that no longer include you. The first night in the assisted living facility was the quietest night of my life. The kind of quiet that doesn't calm you but instead presses against your ribs like a heavy reminder that the world has moved on without you. And as I lay in the small, neatly arranged room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender air freshener, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how a lifetime could be reduced to a suitcase, a patient file, and a room number printed on a door. The staff was kind enough, gentle smiles, soft voices, professional touches. But kindness from strangers never fills the spaces carved out by the absence of family. And no matter how warm their tone, it carried none of the familiarity I longed for. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the hallway floor, every distant murmur, every passing shadow beneath the door reminded me that I was in a place meant for those waiting. Waiting to be checked on, waiting to be remembered, waiting for visits that may never come. At dawn, I sat by the small window overlooking a courtyard where a few residents shuffled along the path with walkers, their heads bowed with a kind of exhaustion I suddenly understood deeply. One of them, a woman with silver hair and trembling hands, waved at me with a tired smile, and something inside my chest ached, because in her eyes I saw myself. I forced a smile back, though it faltered quickly, and I whispered to myself, as if the morning air could carry my words somewhere meaningful, "I had a home once." Hours later, a nurse came in to check my vitals, her voice warm but distant, and as she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm, she asked politely, "Will your family be visiting today?" I opened my mouth, trying to answer with hope, but the truth settled heavily on my tongue like a weight refusing to be lifted. "Maybe," I said softly, even though the uncertainty tightened my throat. The rest of the day passed slowly, the clock ticking louder than any conversation, louder than footsteps, louder than my own heartbeat. And every time I heard the front entrance door close, my heart leapt foolishly, waiting for Michael's familiar silhouette to appear. But it never did. Instead, the hours stretched into an evening filled with the same distant laughter from the courtyard, the same quiet shuffle of slippers down the hallway, the same cold realization that expectations are the heaviest burdens to carry. As I sat at the small dinner table that night, pushing my food around the plate while other residents chatted about grandchildren who lived states away, I felt an unfamiliar stillness settle into me. A kind of acceptance that wasn't peace but something quieter, sadder. A resignation that comes only when you understand that the chapter of your life you thought would be filled with family has instead ended with a fragile whisper in an unfamiliar room. Later, I returned to my bed, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence, and I allowed myself one small moment of weakness, one tear slipping down my cheek as I whispered into the dimly lit room. I did my best. The words hung in the air, soft and trembling, as though waiting for someone, anyone, to reassure me they were true. But the only response was the steady hum of the heater and the distant sound of a door closing far down the hallway. A reminder that life continues even when people leave you behind. As sleep finally pulled at my heavy eyes, one thought echoed through the loneliness like a quiet, fading melody. Love is a lesson you give freely, but not everyone learns it the same way. And sometimes the people you love the most will walk forward without looking back. And in that realization, painful as it was, I understood that the story of my life had reached a chapter one never expected. But even in this lonely room, with darkness settling gently, I still carried the memory of who I once was, and no one, not even those who forgot me, could take that away.